Thanks so much for being with us for this WealthWorks Network Rural Wealth Creation Peer Learning call. Our conversation today is focused on the topics of broadband, infrastructure and services, and regional planning. We're really pleased to have you with us. In order to kick this off in a way that's focused on peer networking, please introduce yourself in the chat. And you can also use the annotation tool in Zoom to make some kind of a mark on the map where you're located or a box around the region that you serve, so we can get to see where everybody is that is calling in today. I see a lot of people from a lot of different types of organizations who are introducing themselves in the chat. A lot of marks coming up on the map. I apologize that the map is not to scale. There may be a few people from Alaska dialing in today, which is very clearly going to be difficult to mark accurately because of the size, but thanks so much for being here. As we get going today, I just wanted to reiterate what I said in my email a little bit ago, that we have organized today's meeting as a Zoom meeting rather than a Zoom webinar intentionally, so that you have the opportunity to turn on your camera if your internet allows you to, and unmute your microphone or your phone and talk to each other during the meeting. We are going to start with a presentation all in the general session for a little bit here, but then we're going to split into breakout groups and have some small group discussion so that you guys have the opportunity to share information about what you're working on and ask questions of peers in a way that's more direct and more focused on networking. So if you are attending today's meeting and you think that your coworkers, also other people from your office that you work with are also going to be attending this meeting, if you could click the 3 dots up in the right-hand corner of your Zoom box and then go down to rename and put your affiliation behind your name. And parentheses or a comma, this can be an acronym, that's fine. When we get to those breakout groups, we thought it would probably work out the best if we can split you up so that you're not necessarily in a group with a bunch of people that you already know. You can compare notes with your colleagues later. So if you click on those 3 dots in the right-hand corner of your picture or your box in Zoom, then you should get a menu that you can rename yourself and put your affiliation or some kind of abbreviation behind your name. That way, when we are splitting the breakout groups up, we can try to split you up from your colleagues. So it looks like a lot of you have had the opportunity to mark the map and to introduce yourself in the chat. So let's go ahead and move on. And Brittany, if you can clear the annotations when you have the chance. So today's call is part of a series of calls. We held one a few weeks ago that was focused on local foods, recreation and tourism and entrepreneurship. And we'll be doing a 3rd call here in a few weeks on workforce development, energy, and forestry, while we're focusing today on broadband, infrastructure and services, and regional planning. And when we think about infrastructure and services, that of course can include broadband. That's such a big issue normally in rural places, as well as especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, that we wanted to call out broadband specifically, but infrastructure and services can also include water and wastewater, transportation, waste management, other kinds of infrastructure and services. We won't probably talk a whole lot about energy related infrastructure today because that's a topic for the call coming up later in March, but that certainly is another infrastructure related issue. And all 3 of these calls are being hosted by the NATO Research Foundation, but in partnership with the group of WealthWorks hubs that provide technical assistance around the country and with funding support from USDA Rural Development. So our goals for today are really focused on peer learning and networking. We'll start with a few slides that just lay the groundwork about what rural wealth creation is. But we really do want you to have the opportunity to talk with peers and use that breakout group time to bounce ideas off of each other and share information. If you are having an unstable internet connection, then you may wish to dial in by phone. The confirmation email you got from Zoom or the calendar invitation should have a phone number and an access code in it. And the phone may be a more stable way for you to join and at least be able to hear what's going on, even if you get kicked off from the internet connection periodically. If you do, hopefully you'll be able to join us again, but I know that it doesn't always work out that way. If you have any problems, please check the Zoom website, or you can chat directly to Brittany Salazar, who is my NATO co-host for today. So we'll start with a little background on what WealthWorks or rural wealth creation is. It's an approach to doing rural economic development that really is looking to intentionally link up existing assets in the community with real market demand for the products and services that can be produced there, and to do it in ways that are really meaningful and improving community and economic development over time and quality of life. This is done by focusing on 3 principles: building multiple forms of wealth at the same time, boosting local ownership and control, and really being intentionally inclusive, building those livelihoods for everyone. We'll zoom in on what those 3 principles are a little bit, starting with these 8 forms of community capital. If you've heard me talk about WealthWorks before, you may have heard me say that when I first learned about rural wealth creation, it reminded me of the triple bottom line approach to development, but on steroids. Instead of splitting into those 3 categories of social, environmental, and economic impacts, we're really looking across these 8 forms of assets or community capitals, looking at individual, intellectual, natural, built capital, which we'll probably talk a lot about today, financial capital, political capital, social capital, and cultural capital, with culture being that bounding box around us that influences everything that we do and all the decisions that we make. Zooming in on that issue of local ownership and control, that really means creating opportunities for people who are within the region to have a say in controlling those assets and in what happens with those assets and how that gets used over time. So that includes the resources within the region, as well as ways that businesses get formed, such as through supporting entrepreneurship and startups, small businesses, co-ops. All of those kinds of things keep that ownership local within the region, and the benefits of the financial returns that come from that as well. That third issue of increasing livelihoods for everyone includes being intentionally inclusive for people that may not have been at the table where decisions were being made in the past. And I want to talk just briefly about why that's important. We've seen over the last several years an increase in rural diversity. There's this idea, I feel like, that gets maybe tossed about in the media or elsewhere, of rural America being fairly homogenous, and it's really not. The experiences that people have in different parts of rural America are very different in different parts of the country. And we've seen in the last several years an increase in rural racial diversity as one aspect of that. But even in places that are relatively racially homogenous, there still may be differences in the religions and the languages that people speak. There will still be people who are low income, people who are disabled, and all of those may be factors in whether they feel included and whether they have been actively engaged in decision making in the past. When we're thinking about being intentionally inclusive, we're not just thinking about how do all these various people benefit from economic development activities, but how can they contribute to it as well, which may be in all of these different dimensions and maybe throughout an entire planning and implementation process, that people can be engaged even if they are have been underserved in the past. In rural wealth creation, we're oftentimes looking at organizing partners so that we can identify who can work together for the benefit of the region, and to do so in ways that serve their own self-interests as well. And we use the term value chain when we're talking about work in specific economic sectors. And I wanted to introduce who those major value chain partners are before we split into our breakout groups, because in the conversation that we had last month about local foods, recreation and tourism and entrepreneurship, we really focused a lot on some of the conversations about building out those value chains and those sector partners. So when we work with partners to map out a value chain, we focus on who the demand partners are. Who wants the products and services that are being produced in the economic sectors or the infrastructure and services that we're looking at? And then we look at who the transactional partners are, these TP folks in the diagram. Who's involved in creating the products or the services and delivering them to these demand partners? With the help of these support partners, the SP line down below, who are people that may be investors, they may be providing technical assistance or support, maybe they're nonprofits, maybe they are legislators and regulators that are providing the framework in which all of these transactions are taking place. And then this blank box in the top is actually a really important box, because these partners are not likely to get together and work together on their own without having some kind of a person or an organization serving as a coordinator to keep the players all sort of working in the same direction and to hold those collective values. What are those big picture goals that everyone is working toward, and how can we stay coordinated on working toward them together? So this diagram is similar, but it has some sample partners listed in an agriculture and local foods related value chain. And I put this in because I think thinking about local foods as a sector helps to really explain who these types of partners are. So the demand partners in this case are some institutional partners, as well as general household consumers, anybody who eats, essentially. We have our transactional partners who are involved in growing the foods and selling the foods and creating food products from raw materials and getting them to the people who want them, as well as some examples of types of support partners. And the coordinator in this case could be one of a whole host of different types of organizations that are involved in regional development and also involved in local foods. I think it's a little easier to think about an economic sector that's producing things when we talk about mapping value chains, but these same types of concepts are applicable to thinking about broadband infrastructure and services in regional planning as well. So what does that look like? Doing rural wealth creation and doing broadband and infrastructure and services is probably going to look on the surface a lot like just a regular effort to be developing those building blocks of community and economic development, focusing on the telecommunications, the water and wastewater, the transportation, other kinds of infrastructure and services, where we're looking at mapping who has access, where the gaps are. We're investing in expanding the services that are already there, connecting to consumers, marketing and branding what's already there, as well as the expansions. But all of that is happening in this context of doing intentional inclusion. We know, especially when we're thinking about broadband and infrastructure and services, oftentimes people in those most rural places are getting the least amount of service. So how can we think about intentional inclusion to reach those people who have traditionally not been at the table when we're planning for these, or historically haven't been served very well by existing services? We're also building multiple assets within the community. All of these types of infrastructure generally are going to fall into that built or physical capital of the puzzle piece diagram that I showed earlier. But while we're doing that, are we also looking at ways to improve skills and health through the provision of broadband? Probably so, if we're looking at things like telehealth and remote education. Are we opening up opportunities to focus on local ownership and control? of businesses that may have new market opportunities through these expanded infrastructure efforts, as well as looking at who owns and controls the broadband and the infrastructure and services themselves. Are there opportunities to develop telecommunications co-ops, for instance, or to work through an existing rural electric co-op to add broadband to the kind of work that they're doing already? Are there other entities that are already working in that space that have the public good as part of their mission, so that they may be willing and interested to look at ways that they can affordably expand broadband in ways that are affordable to the community and also are covering their costs for the provider, but not necessarily intended to maximize profit because the entity is looking at the public good as well. And then all that while keeping in mind that we're focused on real market demand. We're not just making a thing and pushing it out to an unknown market. We're connecting with who the demand is and talking about what it is that they need and developing the products and services that meet those needs. Regional planning is similar. When you look at a regional plan, whether it's a comprehensive economic development strategy or another kind of a capital plan or a land use plan, a WealthWorks infused plan is probably going to have many of the same chapters and types of content that another type of plan would have. It's looking at asset-based community and economic development, building those infrastructure and services, identifying strategies for future economic development efforts and other types of efforts that are going to be focused on building up those economic sectors that already exist in the region and have an opportunity to grow. And most plans are going to be identifying some kinds of metrics, milestones, and indicators of success. But the key to WealthWorks is, again, like planning for broadband infrastructure and services, we're doing all of that while we're doing intentional inclusion. From how we do our public outreach and how we structure the advisory committee that may be helping to develop or guide the development of that regional plan, we're looking at that intentional inclusion. When we're looking at those strategies and who those strategies are intended to benefit, we're looking at how can we create jobs for low-income people? How can those intended beneficiaries really be involved throughout the whole process? We're also going to use that planning process to be building those multiple assets, drawing back from those 8 forms of community capital so that we're building multiple things at the same time without harming any of the assets that already exist in the community. We're looking for opportunities to build up local ownership and control in some of those economic sectors that are already existing in the region and that have opportunities for growth. And we're helping all of those private sector partners connect with real market demand while we're doing that. So hopefully some of this sounds somewhat familiar to you. WealthWorks didn't appear out of nowhere. It's an evolution and a combining of a lot of different ideas about economic development into a framework that seems like it works in a lot of sectors and in a lot of rural places, and probably in other places as well, not just rural places, but does seem to have a lot of resonance in the places that have picked it up and used it over the last 12 years or so. So we're going to go ahead and move into our breakout groups. We've got facilitators lined up to run these breakout groups, and all of our facilitators are experienced technical assistance providers or practitioners who are familiar with those principles of doing WealthWorks, as well as familiar with working in some aspects of broadband infrastructure and services and regional planning. So our facilitators will be Debbie Luther with Communities Unlimited, Ted Steiger with the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and Brett Alfin with 6 Mo City Services in Southern Ohio. And in those breakout groups, this is your opportunity to chat with your peers. So please start out with introductions, share who you are and where you are and what kind of work you're doing around the topics for today, who you're working with, who are your major partners, your major assets, and what your challenges are. We'll spend probably not quite an hour in these breakout groups, And then we'll come back together at the end of our 90 minutes together to share those highlights and key takeaways from the breakout group discussions. So Brittany, you can go ahead and activate those breakout groups. So let's go ahead and reconvene. In this main session, as we close out today, I wanted to give you guys the opportunity to talk about what your major themes and highlights from those breakout group discussions were. I know I bounced from group to group and was making a lot of notes, but I want to open it up to our 3 group facilitators first. But if anybody else has comments, please unmute yourself and speak or type in the chat as well. Let's maybe start with Debbie, if you're back and you want to unmute. Say how things went in your group.
I had a great group of folks and lots of good information exchanged there. I felt like that one of the things that we talked about was the perceptions in the rural communities and the facts that it's not just about getting the internet into the communities, but also changing the mindset of the local people so that they recognize how important it is in their community to have internet there. And then one of the things that was talked about, a lot of different resources were discussed. And then also the fact that we should not give up on applying for funding to address these issues, but just keep applying and reapplying and so forth to address the issues so that we have the financing to be able to get that out there. And I would welcome anybody from my group to chime in if I've missed something that we talked about there.
Really quick, Debbie, thank you for facilitating. You know, we talked a little bit about some historical parallels with rural electrification. I think during the Depression that might have been a program, and sort of access to clean water and telephone lines, and then this idea of sort of, Amy brought up resilience, and I talked about sort of full participation in society, and so we talked a little bit about how there might be a lack of a profit motive for broadband investments in some places at least, but there may be some other really important arguments to make for these investments.
Yeah, that's really true. Brett, do you want to share what some of the highlights were from your breakout group?
Sure do. After we figured out who everybody's favorite baseball team was, we had a great information exchange about broadband.
Of course.
Of course, any Brett session has that. We talked a lot about partnerships, and kind of one of the key challenges that we identified was there's so many parties in this conversation. And, you know, WealthWorks is kind of critical to identifying your partners and knowing who those partners are and what they're doing. And we talked a lot about rural communities and planning organizations and other parties are starting to have agency in that conversation. And so that kind of makes it more difficult to know who's doing what. And so we talked about just good old fashioned stick with it. Talk to your partners as much as you can, as often as you can, about what it is you're trying to do. And then we had an interesting discussion there at the end about ways that the WealthWorks approach or concepts has made its way into SEDS and other planning documents that are put forth by planning organizations. And I just thought it was good. And anybody else from our group that wants to chime in, please do.
Since we've got a bigger group here in this closing session, if anybody works in an organization or in partnership with an organization that develops a regional plan or a comprehensive economic development strategy or a similar type of a document, that you either intentionally or unintentionally have some parallels between that work and the WealthWorks principles of building multiple forms of capital or assets and emphasizing local ownership and control and focusing on equity and intentional inclusion. If you want to drop the link into that chat, you may have done that in your breakout group, but only your breakout group colleagues saw that and not the whole audience. So if you want to drop that link into the chat, then we can share that with all of the attendees. And I see a couple of you, it looks like you've got to jump off, but thanks so much for being here. And I want to turn it over to Ted. What happened in your breakout group that was significant? What were some of the highlights?
Yes, thank you. I wish I wish we would have talked about baseball, but we dove right in. I think, highlighting what some other folks talked about, we were fortunate to have some federal partners with our group, but the key highlights were partnerships, 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 and then also guiding, once your community has a great plan, that you need to take necessary steps to do that public engagement piece, and how WealthWorks can help with that as well. I think that was a key point. We also dove into a little bit more just to let everybody know about USDA's work with the Reconnect program. They are currently taking comments on some changes that they're looking to make. Obviously, USDA received this funding, I think, 2 years ago, if my memory serves me well. But they are taking comments right now on how to better reach communities. The application process can be a bit burdensome. It can cost communities a lot. So we discussed, a couple of those points as well, and some of those resources are in there. Thanks, Carrie, for talking about that. So that's what we spent a lot of our time doing, and then also started talking about, what some policy changes would look like, at least at the federal level. If broadband providers are receiving public dollars, what are their responsibilities to serve hard to reach and low income homes. So I think it was a great discussion, and definitely open up to anybody else who was on the in that breakout to summarize.
Yeah, if anybody else wants to share your highlights from those breakout conversations, we'd love to hear them. I put a link into the chat with the Federal Register notice about submitting comments to USDA about the Reconnect program. And I see Shirley has also dropped a link into the chat with the State of Alaska Broadband Plan. Thank you for that. And I see a question in here for Dodd. I think Dodd actually just had to drop off to join another meeting. So he had made a comment in the chat about broadband in the Rescue Act. But let's see, Stephen is answering it. It's $7 billion for broadband from the stimulus. Stephen, do you want to unmute and talk any further about what you've read?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, the thing is, at the end of the day, of that, 7 or 8 billion, how much is going to each state, and what we need to do to sort of stay on top of it. Just briefly, 8 or so years ago, there was a big move from Arizona to do broadband, and we were really late to the funding table. So we kind of got whatever the crumbs were left over. So that just gives you an indication, as this bill gets passed and these monies do get dispersed, you want to be in front of all the right people to be able to take advantage of it, so that it actually does go to the places that it needs to. Yeah, and so I think all the major headlines are espousing about 7 billion from the stimulus specifically towards broadband. What your state gets, if you have a state broadband office, what they're applying for and things like that are going to obviously be different depending on what state.
And Stephen, was that funding directed through the FCC or USDA? Or
that's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah, because I didn't see it. I didn't see it in the USDA provision, so I'm assuming it would have to be through another federal agency. Clearly, the package hasn't passed yet, but
yeah, I think it's the EDA as well. Dodd was mentioning as well that they're going after a EDA infrastructure grant, which as of recently, I think they were really focused on the planning side of it, and they weren't as concerned with funding the actual infrastructure, only because I only know that because certain organizations close to us went to EDA and said, hey, you want to fund our $48 or $38 million project? And they were like, not really. But so I think some of those monies might be going towards the EDA to do that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the funding is directed through EDA's Economic Adjustment Assistance Program. That's so pretty flexible. So thanks for bringing that up.
Totally.
Yeah, this is Tim O'Connell real quick with USDA again. And through the 2021 Appropriations Act, NTIA, National Telecommunications and Information Agency, does have $1 billion in grant funds for tribal broadband. They are currently writing those regulations now. And I think NTIA got a total of 1.5 billion in grants. They have 2 smaller grant programs. So I'll drop a link into the chat on access to that information.
Thanks, Tim. And I think several of you have sort of hinted at the issue of equity that is so important with looking at infrastructure and services and economic development generally, but really comes up really so clearly in broadband as well. That issue of access is definitely not equitable right now and is difficult to get to a point of equity when we have so many partners involved in delivering broadband that are oriented toward a profit motive, that they've got to have a market that they can sell to. So if I could turn quickly to a couple of people who made comments in the breakout sessions. Amy, you had a comment about measurement and using measurement to look more broadly beyond the profit motive. And then after Amy, Cheryl, if you would talk about value propositions real quick, if I can pick on you guys.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess, there's, with the WealthWorks approach, we're looking at building multiple forms of wealth, and that really all of these forms are needed to make resilient communities. And so if you're just measuring financial wealth, or in this case, I guess, if you're looking at the profit margins and you're not able to get broadband to everyone through just a kind of for-profit model, then it would be, you can make a case for investing in broadband by showing what other forms of wealth you can build in terms of, building people's access to livelihoods opportunities, and other forms of resilience, like what kinds of human capital or social capital are you building? And that can be an argument to get further funding for this type of investment.
Thanks, Amy. Cheryl, can I pick on
What
you?
Amy's talking about from measurement is great, to look at all of the 8 forms of wealth to say, how would we measure success in terms of broadband is fantastic, but it feeds right into that value proposition, right? So it doesn't matter really if you're talking to healthcare providers and their foundations around the importance of telehealth and investing in it, or if you're talking to educational cooperatives or around student success and so on and so forth. So, or even local units of government in terms of how can people participate in your meetings if they don't have access to broadband and they're all homebound or we're in the middle of a pandemic. So the value proposition obviously changes based upon who the audience is, but it also changes based upon what you're trying to measure, to Amy's point. So you could talk to educational school districts around they know they want their students to have access to broadband. That's intellectual capital, right? So there's some opportunities that also spur up. So we use the 8 forms of wealth in measurement, the way Amy was talking about, in all of our federal applications, because there is something there that's going to resonate beyond miles, pounds, jobs, the traditional quantitative measures that are measured. There's more to measure.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We are out of time for today. I've got some links to additional resources that are on screen, some of which I was involved in producing, some of which are not my own, but are definitely good resources to be looking at for learning more about rural wealth creation and who some of the hub entities may be. I want to point out that Aspen Institute link is a really great resource to be thinking about who can be coordinating this kind of work, and some measurement resources as well. I'll throw my contact information up here too. If you have any additional links or resources that you would like to share, feel free to drop them in an email to me. I took a few notes and have saved our chat for today so that I can share that out after the fact as well. So thank you all so much for being here. It was great to see you and to talk with you and to learn together. I hope to see some of you as well on March 22nd. Everybody take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks all.
See y'all.
Thank you.